I am very pleased to introduce Katrina Robson. Now, Katrina is one of the founders of Love Barrow Families, an organisation formed in 2014 with the aim of offering a truly integrated service, beginning with the families in Barrow who have the most complex needs and who often account for the largest majority of the workload for agencies throughout the tiers of care. Welcome, Katrina. I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. I agree with everything that Cormac's just said, and I hope that everyone who speaks, what we're going to say is probably going to complement each other. So first of all, it feels important to say that I'm from Barrow-in-Furness in Cumbria. I was born there, brought up there, moved away once or twice and then come back. I'm the eldest of 6 children from a everyday working class family, like most of the other families in Barrow. Barrow is a northern working class town. We've got about 70,000 of us there. It's traditionally a shipbuilding town, steelworks. And I've worked now for a number of years with children and families in my own community in different capacities. So as a foster carer many years ago, in children's homes for teenagers, as a social worker for the local authority, for the NSPCC, we looked after children. And then just before I set up Love Barrow Families, I was working for the NHS in the child and adolescent mental health service as a children's therapist or play therapist and one of the senior mental health practitioners. So I've done lots of different things. And I guess brought a lot of my own self to what I do, and I'm able to do more of that now than I think I could when I was younger and I worked in social work. So Simon invited me to do this talk. I was told that I had 10 minutes. It was suggested that I speak from my experience and try and focus on the kind of policies that we need to tackle the current failing social care system, really, for families. So I feel like I've got a lot to say in a short space of time. And I was thinking last night about when we first set up Love Barrow Families, and before it started, basically to be able to get some money from the NHS, we had to do a presentation, and I had to do a presentation in 1 minute. So I thought, I've got 10 minutes and I'll try and come up with 10 points that last around about a minute each that I can get across. So it's the headlines, not the detail. And if people struggle a little bit with my accent, I'm sorry about that. Lots of people say that I talk really fast, and I am Barrovian, and people seem to not be able to understand us sometimes. So I want to start with my experience of being a social worker, which was in well, actually, my first experience of social work was when I was a foster carer in the late 1980s, when I started to work with local social workers. And then I went away to Manchester University, and I trained to be a social worker and came back and worked for 6 years in my own community, actually in my own patch where I lived, in a local authority children and families team. And at that time, we did everything. When I say everything, I mean practical kind of day-to-day support right up to child protection, care proceedings. It wasn't split into the services that it is now. So what was it like? So social justice brought you in. That's why I became a social worker, and that's why my colleagues became social workers, really. It was a pillar. It was one of the, it was very significant to us all. It was the path really into social work. We were lucky enough to have senior managers who were kind, wise, and also they'd come through the ranks. So they had a lot of experience and kind of worked their way up to the position that they were in. And so we felt safe in the team. We had a code of ethics that was absolutely forefront to social workers, that we held ourselves to, and that our colleagues tried to hold us to as well. We had a belief that children do best when they're looked after in their own family and their own neighbourhoods. And we knew that that was backed up in evidence, and that there's even more evidence that that's the case now. The team that I worked in was a neighbourhood-based team. So it was a multidisciplinary team. So although we weren't all in one team, the social work team was separate to the other services. Because we worked on the patch, we had really strong relationships with health visitors, schools, teachers, GPs, and there was a kind of recognition that everybody knew something about families that needed to be heard in order to understand what was going on. And one of the first things I was taught as a social worker was to fill in what was called a cackle, a form that was called a cackle, and it terrified me as a young new social worker. And it was a form that was filled in when someone raised a concern or a worry about a child or a young person. And basically it listed all the different services that you needed to contact to talk to about what they knew. And the form had to be signed, and it had to be signed off by a manager. And I sometimes think about that when I look at the practice that's happening around me from social workers. And it seemed like quite a simple thing to do, but it was really important because it meant that a lot of information was gathered that seems to get missed, I think, these days. So there was a belief in understanding and really understanding what was happening before doing anything, before intervening. We also had a belief in what we used to call therapeutic social work. And some of that was around trying to understand and acknowledge that most of the people who came to us, most of the families who came to statutory services, there was underlying trauma and loss that was impacting on their behaviour. And finally, there was love and compassion, and I think that we felt that in our hearts. It was part and parcel of what we did. The only other thing that I would add looking back is that I was puzzled as a social worker in Barrow, or in my own town, that I seemed to be the only working class social worker, the only social worker that came from Barrow. Most of the other social workers were people who had moved to the Lake District and then worked in Barrow as a social worker. So that was a kind of puzzle for me at the time. And I suppose it's informed some of the way I think about things now. Just checking how much time I'm probably not going to have time to say everything I want to say. So Love Barrow Families we did it, myself and a colleague did it at a time when we were working in statutory services, and we did it kind of out of desperation, really, to do the right thing. And I say simply, it wasn't really simply, but it felt a simple thing to do. We talked to some of the families who were involved with services and asked them to help us to work out how to do things better. And kind of linking with what Cormac's just said, my family that I came from were no different in many ways to the families that I was working with. You know, I came from quite a complex family, a family that lived in poverty. We were lucky enough not to come to the attention of social services, but we weren't that different. So we asked families to help, and we designed a small team really that was co-located in a school that brought together all the services around families. And we did it within statutory services, and they allowed us to do it for 2 years. So we did everything: adult mental health, child mental health, child protection. It was all in one team. We had one assessment, so people didn't have to tell the stories over and over again. And we used everything we knew, everything we'd gathered and known over the years, everything we'd read. And we also surrounded ourselves with what we called wise owls. So we had probably about 5 different people who helped us and kept us on track. We had an independent evaluation that evidenced really great outcomes. You know, numbers of children subject to child protection were much less, families were doing better. Psychiatric stays for parents were reduced. There's lots and lots of positives. But we weren't able to retain our funding, and we became a community interest company. So the organisation is a bit different now than it was. So the things that I learned, the biggest things I suppose that I learned from Love Barrow Families that add to what I learned from being a social worker, and I learned them from the families really, is that the power of a sense of belonging and what this gave to families, particularly those families who didn't have extended family, and also what it gave to us as a team and how it felt. And also that understanding is key. So someone said, understanding is love in action. And there's another quote, love is the quality of attention we pay to things. I think that understanding what's happening before you decide to do anything is really important, and having an open mind to the complexity of people's lives, of our lives. I also learned, I guess I knew this already, but to expect families to have assets and gifts to share and give back. And we learned something about, we now call it growing our own, but how to help people people who live in Barrow, come from our own community, to do what I was able to do with support, to train so that we can grow our own and have some local helping professionals rather than people from outside. So jumping back to policies, Love Barrow Families, the advantage of being a community interest company was that we wrote our own. So our policies were imbued with our values: social justice, love, asset-based, working, equality. We really tried hard to make sure that they came through in the policies. And I guess the other thing is that Love Barrow Families was set up at the end of 2013 when we thought things were bad, but actually the environment is much worse now than it was. And any policies or changes that exist, don't they, within the current state of the world, seeing a growing chasm between the poor and the rich. And it's difficult as a professional to exist in this environment, let alone families. So people like Cormac and Angela, who's going to speak a bit later on, I think, can talk more eloquently, I guess, about assets and community development than I can. And you'll hear Kathy from Children England, who will probably tell you a little bit, I hope she will, about the work that the young people have done in redesigning the welfare state. One of the things that's been good for me, and I think for others as well, is to connect with like-minded people. The last thing I wanted to talk about was trauma, and I think Cormac said quite a few things that add to what I'm going to say. I've thought about trauma quite a lot recently, and I've been listening to lots of talks about trauma, and had the opportunity to listen to some Indigenous people talk about their lives. And there was a number of graves that were discovered in Canada recently, children's graves, children who had been removed from their families, and it seemed to send shockwaves around. But it didn't shock the Indigenous families that lost the children. They already knew what they were up against, really. And it reminded me of my own struggle to make sense of the outrage, passion and resignation that myself and my own community feels. We know that we're the bottom of the pile. No, we know we're at the bottom. We know that we're feared and we represent a threat. We also know that often stuff is done to us in the name of helping, and it's sometimes well-intentioned, but it's also meaningless, just words. And often the ideas of someone who's more entitled than us, their ideas of what's good for us. School readiness is one of those that really annoys me when people talk about that, as though we don't know how to get our children ready for school. We're judged by other people's standards, and we know in our bones that we're not entitled. We accept our bins not being emptied, our town being desecrated. And when in Barrow recently, we've got a new CEO who's been a real breath of fresh air. The bins on the beach where I walk near to me were emptied and not overspilling. And it made me feel really good as a resident. And it made me think, maybe we are entitled to expect better. Maybe we matter. And finally, like the Indigenous peoples, I heard speaking their truth. In Barrow, we already know in our hearts and our souls that love and belonging are as natural and fundamental as wealth, intellect, and we love our kids fiercely. That love is what connects us. It's already there. It's just our pride gets stripped from us sometimes. It should be celebrated. That's something that Cormac talks about. We should be celebrating it. It's already there. And we should be cheered on as well. So going back to policies, as people will be aware, the care review is currently happening. And it just seems to me, we need to do the right thing. We just need to do the right thing. And somebody famous has said, justice is what love looks like on the streets. And I think if we can reflect that in some of our policies, then that'll be real progress. So I don't know if I've managed to do that in my 10 minutes.
You are almost spot on, Katrina. You're 1 minute over, but I won't hold that against you. That was lovely. Again, thank you so much for talking about the work that you do, and the kindness in which you approach all your work really shines through. So thank you again, Katrina, for that.